honor of introducing Professor Carlos Santana today. Professor Santana is an associate professor of philosophy. He identifies as a philosopher of science, but I really like how he self-identifies on his website. On his website, he says, "I'm a consulting engineer to the sciences." He says, "I work with researchers to identify conceptual, methodological, and value-oriented issues in the sciences and bring philosophical methods to bear in addressing them." So today, I take it he's going to be doing more actual science than merely advising us science. But I like that to have Carlos contribute himself. So Carlos is a professor in our department, but Carlos is especially special to us because Carlos is also an alum of our department. So I had the honor of being on Carlos's committee like 10 years ago. And I was on his committee, and so I was supposed to be teaching him and stuff. But it was clear from the minute I met Carlos, which I think was at my job talk, that Carlos is way smarter than me. So I think actually while serving on his committee, I learned a lot more from Carlos than Carlos learned from me. So I'm excited to have that happen again today. And as we look forward to hearing this talk about bears.
Thanks, Dan. That's very nice and much too humble on your part. When my partner asked me, "What are you working on?" and I said, "A paper on the philosophy of science of historical linguistics," she said, "That's a mouthful and boring. You should just write about bears instead." So to try and fix that, I'm going to talk about the philosophy of science of historical linguistics and bears. Though you're going to have to wait a minute before I get to the bears. I think historical linguistics is interesting for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons is that I work both on linguistics and on historical sciences, like geology and paleontology, and this is a nice way to sort of bring some of those research programs of mine together. But of course, the main reason I think that historical linguistics is philosophically interesting is that language history is human history. And there is really interesting work happening right now in historical linguistics that's helping inform questions about human history that are difficult to answer otherwise. So what we see here is a language family tree or a phylogeny. The terminal branches of the tree represent different languages. In this case, you can't read these small labels, but what matters is these are each a different Uto-Aztecan language. And the phylogenetic tree is a model that can represent multiple things. In many phylogenies, including this one, the branch lengths represent time. So longer branches represent longer periods of time. And then the branching events in the tree represent shared ancestry and divergence. So this is a model representing the evolutionary history of this family of languages. And you can use this kind of model for all sorts of things. Of course, you might just be intrinsically interested in how these languages are related to each other. But you can also use them to make inferences about other features of human history. So these researchers combined this model. These researchers combined this model, the phylogeny, with ethnographic data in order to support one of sort of three leading hypotheses about the geographic origins of the Uto-Aztecan peoples, as well as claims about their temporal origins and their ancestral cultural practices. So you know, they're supporting a lot of claims about human history here on the basis of in part, on that phylogenetic model. And let's see where we're going here. Here's another example of a similar kind of work. So here's a phylogenetic tree of the Indo-European languages, and these researchers are using this phylogenetic tree to support a claim about the geographic origins of Indo-European peoples, which has been a perennially popular topic to debate in anthropology and linguistics. And these are just two examples of a lot of exciting work happening in this sort of domain. And as a philosopher of science, what I want to do is I want to talk about the sort of the methods and the patterns of scientific inference that are involved in this kind of research. So here's a simplified version of the inference that's happening here is we have sets of linguistic data. We're inferring the phylogenies or language trees from those data, and then we're combining that with archaeological and biological information in order to make historical inferences. And I want to defend sort of 2 points here about this pattern of inference in my talk today. One, in most cases, there isn't going to be one best or one true language tree. Instead, there are going to be multiple informative models of the linguistic evolutionary history And second, the inference we make from language trees to historical claims is going to be sensitive to the methods we use to generate a tree. So there's going to be more than one good tree, but any particular tree is going to be good for certain kinds of inferences and not good for other kinds of inferences. And I hope that sounds pretty intuitive. But I think it's important to make this point because the researchers involved in computational phylogenetics and linguistics are really sophisticated in how they think about this arrow here, the inference from linguistic data to generating a tree. And I think they're much more fast and loose generally in how they think about this arrow here, inferring from language trees to claims about human history. And I want to, the idea that I want to sort of push to the scientists here is that there needs to be some sort of explicit justification of this kind of inference on the basis of the methods used in that first step of inference here. That's a big picture overview. So now I'm going to step back and get into some more details about the methods and sort of flesh out these arguments. So the first thing I need to do is I need to spell out for you how we get from linguistic data to trees. And there's more than one way to do this. The traditional way is something called the comparative method. And this is something that historical linguists have been using successfully for a long, long time. This particular tree is from 1863. Again, the particular labels here, don't worry that you can't read them. These are Indo-European languages. And there are some striking things about this tree. One, just how much it agrees with the trees that historical linguists would draw today. Like, this has been a successful method for a long period of time. And while we might say that this particular linguist got some things wrong, big picture, he mostly got things right. Right? This is a well-established successful method. Second, all of this was done by hand. This happened in 1863. That's quite the accomplishment to have collected all the data and analyzed it in a way that lets you make some reliable inferences from it. How does this work? This isn't a talk about the comparative method, so I'm going to just kind of zoom through this. But here's a simplified sort of quick explanation of how it works. You hypothesize that a set of languages are related. You drop concordance lists between those languages. You clean up some of the noise in that data. You use those concordance lists to identify systematic sound changes. And on the basis of the systematic sound changes, you reconstruct a proto-language. And some historical linguists think the proto-language is just a theoretical construct. Others think that it's actually a model of some real language that people spoke sometime in the past. Either way, you can use those reconstructions to either confirm or reject the hypotheses that the languages you're dealing with are related, and you can start to reconstruct that tree or evolutionary history. According to many historical linguists, this is still the gold standard method in historical linguistics. And so this is one useful way of drawing up language trees or reconstructing linguistic phylogenies. It's not the only way scientists draw trees, though. So let's jump over to biology for a minute. Biologists have been using tree diagrams to represent relatedness between biological taxa-like species for a long time as well, going back even to before Darwin. But the most common modern way of doing it is actually much more recent, dating only to the 1960s. And the reason is that biologists for a long time couldn't agree about what this kind of model was meant to represent. A lot of biologists felt like what a tree diagram should represent is observable trait similarities, which would only indirectly represent potential evolutionary histories. And other biologists felt like these sort of tree diagrams, these phylogenies, should represent actual evolutionary history. And the reason it took until the 1960s before the people who wanted them to represent actual evolutionary history won was because we needed technology to catch up. We needed to be able to have data that could let us reconstruct actual evolutionary history, and we need to be able to process that data. So we needed sequencing techniques in molecular biology, and we needed the computers to be powerful enough to generate trees from those sequenced data. Now, in phylogenetics, the sort of properties or traits of each taxon that you're going to use to reconstruct the evolutionary history is called a character. And there are lots of different options for characters in biology. Most commonly, it's sequences of nucleotides from DNA and RNA, or either amino acid sequences from homologous proteins. If you don't know what all that means, it doesn't matter that much. Just know that if we have two different species, we're going to look at their analogous sequences of whatever molecular data we're looking at, and we're going to either say those are the same character or those are not the same character. And on the basis of a bunch of different characters, we're going to try and reconstruct a tree. We can, of course, reconstruct lots of different trees for an evolutionary history. So computational phylogenetics is the use of computational methods to solve an optimization problem. So given the list of the characters we have for each taxon and some assumptions about how evolution works, we're going to try and infer which tree is the optimal representation of evolutionary history in the sense of common ancestry. And biologists have a bunch of different ways of doing this. Some are more common than others, but all of these get used. One thing we can do is we can look for the fewest evolutionary changes of certain sorts. Among other things, this means something like, if we have two characters that are identical, it's more parsimonious if we have a tree that suggests they're descendant of a common ancestor who had that character than to say that that character evolved twice independently. Right? We can do something like, say, for each tree, given the tree and some assumptions about how evolution works, what's the probability that it would generate the data we have about characters? Or we can do the reverse and say, for the data, for each tree, given the data and some assumptions about how evolution works, what's the probability that that data and that evolutionary process would generate this tree? And the point here is not the technical details. The point here is that there are multiple good options for how to do this, and there is no one best method or single gold standard. And it shouldn't be surprising that historical linguists eventually noticed what the biologists were doing with phylogenetics to draw trees, and that some of them thought, oh, this is a new way of drawing trees that might be useful in linguistics as well. Though it did take some time. The use of computational and phylogenetics in linguistics has only happened in the 21st century. So this is a fairly recent, methodological innovation or borrowing in linguistics. It might be kind of obvious that we should use things like genes as characters in phylogenetics in biology. It's a little less obvious what our characters should be in linguistics because language has all sorts of properties which we can represent discretely. And while there are lots of options, as a matter of practice, computational phylogenetics and linguistics almost always focuses on lexical items, sometimes supplemented by, with some information from things like high-level syntactic characters. And there are lots of reasons for this that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A later on, but lexical items are, for computational phylogenetics and linguistics, they're the genes. And what you do is just like you would do with characters in biology, you code them as shared or not shared. So you'd say for this particular character, the cognate words for meat, you'd say English and Swedish share that character. They both get the one there. German and Old English share the character, right? And English doesn't share with German or Old English, et cetera. And then you have a whole list of characters. But you're not going to use the whole, set of lexical items in a language because a lot of them are not going to be very informative. So suppose we're trying to reconstruct relatedness among Western European languages. And we say, well, what word do each of these languages use to refer to this animal? And so you start collecting data on this. In English, we say butterfly. In Spanish, we say mariposa, et cetera, et cetera. And you find out that they all use a different term for this particular animal. And so looking at these lexical items is entirely uninformative to which languages are more related to other languages. Oops, I forgot Denmark. People are always forgetting Denmark. So instead, when you're doing phylogenetics and linguistics, you usually use something that's called a Swadesh list. which is a list of a list of meanings where the lexical change tends to be more conservative and therefore more informative. And you're going to contextualize this, of course, to the relevant, context of your language family. You probably want salmon on a Swadesh list if you're looking at Pacific Northwest languages, and you probably don't want salmon if you're looking at some, languages from East Africa, or something like that. And then you code the lexical items so that you can see which ones are shared between taxa and which ones are not. I'm going to ignore this distinction here, but there are actually two different ways of doing this: cognates or root meaning pairs, and this matters. It can produce different results, but again, there's some technical details I'm just going to gloss over for right now. And then you have all the same options for. This isn't a joke. Generally, the algorithms used in computational phylogenetics for linguistics are just sort of customized versions of the same algorithms that biologists are already using. You have the same options that biologists have for how you're going to infer which tree you think is the best tree. And all of them do get used in linguistics as finally, you're probably going to do some sanity checks on your tree by comparing to things you already know from other sources of information about human cultural and evolutionary history. So we have multiple ways to draw trees even within linguistics. And one thing to note here is even though the outputs are very similar and are about the same thing, about shared ancestry, the type of data being used to generate these outputs, the characters that are being attended to, tend to be different between the comparative method and phylogenetics. So the comparative method, while it's going to draw on other linguistic features in order to reconstruct systematic sound changes, it's the systematic sound changes that are the core data that's being used to reconstruct the tree, whereas in computational phylogenetics, it's almost always lexical items. And as you would expect, this means that often the two methods drop different trees, or trees that disagree with each other. So this is from a study that used one type of phylogenetic algorithm and then compared the outputs to the representations of linguistic relatedness on ethnologue. Ethnologue using language families that have mostly been reconstructed using the comparative method. And blue means they mostly agree. Purple means there's a moderate degree of disagreement between the phylogenetic method and the comparative method. And red means there's a lot of disagreement. And as you can see, it varies from language family to language family, but there's a lot of purple and some red here. That whether we use the comparative method or the phylogenetic method makes a difference. And in fact, there are a lot of publications that use results from phylogenetics to argue for revising what we think language family trees are, precisely because they disagree with the comparative method. All right, all that is just background on the methods. Now we get to some of the philosophical issues. And there's a philosophical issue in the background here that turns into a methodological issue. We want to ask, in what sense language evolves? And I'm asking this question in two ways. One, is language evolution tree-like? Does it make sense to represent language evolution in terms of trees? And a lot of linguists think that this is not the case. So, for example, this is a representation of language relatedness that's not a tree. A tree means something actually technical in graph theory that maps onto something technical in evolutionary biology. Again, technical details I'm not going to get into, but this isn't a tree, but it is a representation of language relatedness. And some linguists like this one think that we should be using alternatives to tree for that reason. But there's another issue that we need to ask about in what sense language evolves. And that's whether linguistic evolution is enough like biological evolution that it makes sense to import methods from evolutionary biology into linguistics. And that is also controversial. So I'm going to cover a bit of the controversy here. Much of the discussion in the academic literature about that's relevant here is discussion of whether cultural evolution is evolution, as in does culture evolve in sort of biology-like Darwinian ways. And some people think obviously it does, that cultural evolution is fundamentally Darwinian in its basic structure. And this is the sort of thing that often gets cited in work that's defending phylogenetic methods in linguistics. And other people think the opposite, that yes, we talk about cultural evolution, but that terminology actually has very different meanings in the two domains. And this is work that often gets cited by people who are opposed to the use of phylogenetic methods in linguistics. Of course, there are like reasonable moderate positions here, which is that cultural change resembles biological evolution in some respects and not in others. And so that means that when we import methods from biology to the study of cultural evolution, including language evolution, we might have to modify those methods somewhat. Or maybe, in some cases, just not use those methods and develop novel techniques. Right? Okay, so there's the broad sort of debate about whether cultural evolution is like biological evolution. Let's apply this to linguistics. So some people have defended the idea that even if culture can change in weird evolutionary ways that aren't very biology-like, language is sort of a special kind of element of culture that for various reasons make them particularly suitable for using phylogenetic trees. And some of the people who introduced phylogenetics to linguistics make explicitly this argument. So this table here is part of an argument made by Atkinson and Gray for the use of phylogenetic methods in linguistics on the basis of analogies between biological evolution and language change. On the other hand, there are, as I've already shown you, there are people who think there are more informative ways to think about language relatedness and similarity, and these people tend to be skeptical of phylogenetic methods since phylogenetic methods produce trees as outputs. Some people make very strong claims, like there's no chance of explaining language by the mechanisms of evolutionary theory. And some people get really mad about the use of methods from biology and linguistics. This fortunately never turned into a paper, but this is a slide from a talk that gets cited a lot in the academic literature on this, that these new mathematical methods, meaning computational phylogenetics, are the greatest intellectual fraud in the discipline since Chomsky. Obviously, we shouldn't take this guy seriously because he has no idea how to format slides without giving people headaches. Sorry, I'll take that off the... But my point is that there are people who really think that it is a mistake to use computational phylogenetics as opposed to traditional methods in historical linguistics. But of course, we don't want to be extremists with bad slides. We want to be reasonable, moderate people with slides that don't give headaches. So we're going to say, look, language change is tree-ish. Obviously, there are going to be some differences, and the thing to do is to think through what those differences are and what they mean for what we do in the science, right? And I want to focus us for a minute on one particular feature. There are lots of things that we could talk about here, but I'm going to focus on one particular feature, which is that it might be that different parts of language are tree-like to different degrees. And I'm going to make a case for a minute that lexical change is particularly untree-like compared to other parts of language. And this is a little speculative, but I have arguments. And the reason this is going to be interesting is because computational phylogenetics generates trees on the basis of some of the most untree-like linguistic characters. And then I'm going to set up that problem so I can suggest why, what it might tell us about our use of this method. So here's one way, a striking way in which lexical change is particularly non-tree-like in the sense of not evolving in the way that sort of Darwinian evolution by descent works. So in cultural evolution, you get a weird thing called reappearance of ancestral traits. And it's true that in biology, ancestral traits can reappear through things like back mutation, where a mutation goes one way for a while and then it takes a step back. But reappearance of ancestral traits isn't just taking a step back, it's reaching back into the past and pulling something into the present. So when 15th century Italians started adopting aspects of first century Roman culture, they weren't just like taking a step back to their previous cultural state. They were reaching back over 1,000 years and bringing something back. Religious fundamentalism is often something similar. And of course, it doesn't have to be like long periods of time. It could be things like fashions that just crop up once a generation or something like that. And this happens in languages with lexical change, though not very often with other aspects of language. So here's a kind of example. So Spanish is a descendant of Latin, and most lexical items in Spanish are are products of a gradual direct descent from Latin. So the Spanish escuchar, to listen, is a descendant of auscultare. But Spanish has also, done the thing where, over 1,000 years later, it reaches back and resurrects something from Latin. So that same Latin ancestor, in a way that's not a process of sort of gradual inheritance, ends up being re-imported into Spanish in the modern era for auscultar, to use a stethoscope. And, same thing with the Spanish words for milk, and then the reappearance of the same ancestor for dairy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't necessarily think that this particular untree-like feature is like the most important to consider in phylogenetics. I'm using this because it's a very sort of striking example of the way that lexical change can happen in ways that don't look like Darwinian descent with modification. What is widely recognized as important to phylogenetics is horizontal transfer, because trees, once the branching branches, the branches don't come back together. That's called reticulation, and there are ways that you can incorporate reticulation into your phylogenetic algorithm, but it's messy. And the problem is that whatever pattern of inference you're using, if there's horizontal transfer, that might turn into noise that sort of deceives your method. So horizontal transfer means when you have characters that move across taxa in ways that don't represent their shared ancestry. So for instance, English is more closely related to German than it is to Irish or French. However, the English word for onion comes from a horizontal transfer from French. And so if, as a piece of data, if we're looking at the terms for onion in different languages, that piece of data would tell us that English and French are more closely related than English and German, which isn't true, right? And horizontal transfer, of course, is very, very, very common when it comes to lexical change. And obviously other features of language, syntax and phonology and so on, are transferred horizontally, but usually those types of features of language require long, sustained, intense contact between languages. Languages adopting new sounds from each other takes a lot more work than a language adopting a new word from each other, right? And dealing with this problem is one of the major challenges of computational phylogenetics in linguistics. I'll highlight one third way in which lexical change tends to be non-Darwinian in ways that might not apply equally to other aspects of language. For most aspects of language, speakers of the languages aren't aware of the changes that their languages are undergoing. And in part, this is because speakers of languages just aren't aware of the units of language in most aspects of language. We wouldn't need a linguistics department if it was just intuitive that things like determiners and phonemes exist. Like these are things scientists have to discover through work. And so random speakers of languages can't intentionally direct things, changes involving these types of features. However, speakers are consciously aware of lexical items. And we can just invent new ones. We can say, I invented a device, I'm going to call it a scuba, right? Or you can do as the French have tried to do and say, well, this lexical item is trying to enter our language, but we're going to introduce an alternative because that sounds too much like English. Or you can do things like have online censors that block certain words, and then people can intentionally introduce alternatives to those words for online, right? And this is not Darwinian, right? Darwinian evolution is not directed, it's not intentional. So to the extent that lexical change is intentional and directed, and other aspects of language aren't, that's something special about lexical change. So all of that is to say I've spent 7 minutes now talking about the way that the primary characters you use in computational phylogenetics might be different than other potential characters we would use to do computational phylogenetics. And that should have us scratching our heads a little bit, because if lexical change is particularly on tree-like and computational phylogenetics is generating trees, that seems like a weird choice to make. And now I want to tell you why that's not that much of a problem, because it's going to be informative to learn why that's not much of a problem. And the reason, of course, why that's not much of a problem is bears. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about something called discordance. Discordance is what happens when your phylogenetic trees don't agree with each other. And I'm going to talk about some recent developments in biology about how we handle discordance that I don't think linguistics has caught up to yet. Here's the bear family of all the living bear taxa. Or I should say, here's the bear family according to some phylogenetics on nuclear DNA. In other words, DNA from the cell nucleus, which is not the only place that DNA is found in our bodies. Here are two other phylogenetic trees that turn out to be different about theirs. This is Y chromosome DNA, and you get a different tree here because there's a slightly different evolutionary history for Y chromosomes, because Y chromosomes are only passed down from male to male. This is mitochondrial DNA. We get our mitochondria from the ovum of our mother. So this is the matrilineal evolutionary history. And an interesting, perhaps surprising thing happens. All three of those trees disagree with each other about some of the details here. So you can see, for instance, that if we look at the Y chromosome phylogeny, the American black bear gets lumped with brown bears and polar bears, which kind of makes sense because they're all North American. Whereas if we look at the mitochondrial DNA tree, the American black bear gets lumped with the Asian black bears, which makes sense because they're both black bears. But these are two different trees. They disagree. There's discordance here. What do we do about that? Well, here, let me take that off for a second. So here's a nuclear DNA tree. Here's the mitochondrial DNA tree. You can see that they disagree with each other and where they put the black bears, right? One option here is to say that one of these is the true tree. There is, for some reason, there's a bias in one set of data or that's missing part of the story, and one of these trees is a better tree. Another option here would be to say they're both true trees and we're learning something by seeing two trees that disagree with each other. What would that mean in this case? Well, what we've learned is that among their many other good qualities, bears are unabashedly slutty. That there's a lot of flow between different bear species. That if a polar bear and a brown bear walk into a bar, they're likely to walk out of that bar paw in paw. Let me fill in some details here. Okay, so drawing on some of Matt Haber's work on recent developments in resolving discordance in biology. So when we're faced with conflicting information about phylogenies, phylogeneticists have two options. One, you can try and resolve the conflict in favor of one tree. And sometimes this will be the right thing to do. Not every tree you redraw is going to be right. And so we can go look for evidence that one tree is mistaken in some way or another. But another thing we might do is say, this discordance is signal rather than noise. We might look for some sort of explanation that explains why we would see differences between the two trees. And we can learn things about evolutionary history that we wouldn't know unless we notice the discordance between trees. So let me give you an example of this with bears. So let's look at brown bears and polar bears. Here's nuclear DNA, here's mitochondrial DNA. Again, the details of these particular phylogenes doesn't matter. I'm going to point to the details here on part D of the figure. So according to nuclear DNA, brown bears and polar bears split around 600,000 years ago and became two different species. According to mitochondrial DNA, the split was only around 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 30,000 years or whatever. And we could say here, well, mitochondrial DNA, that's a smaller data set than nuclear DNA. Let's just run with the nuclear DNA and say that the true tree is the 600,000 tree. But what these biologists argue is, well, no, we know that mitochondrial DNA is representing a sort of different perspective on evolutionary history. It's representing matrilineal descent. What this is suggesting to us, what the discordance is telling us, is that sometime around 150,000 years ago, there was a polar bear population bottleneck. which would make sense given climate changes that were happening around the time. And during that population bottleneck, a male polar bear found a very sexy female brown bear, and that female brown bear is now the ancestor of all living polar bears. That polar bear Eve is a brown bear that lived 150,000 years ago. Both trees, if this explanation is right, are true. There was a speciation event 600,000 years ago, and then there was introgression through hybridization, would be the technical biological term here, where a female polar bear DNA entered, female brown bear's DNA entered the polar bear lineage, and then sort of, by whatever chance, and she ended up being the ancestor to all modern polar bears. We have a complex evolutionary history, a complex lineage, and we only see that complexity when we take discordance as being informative. If you think polar bears are slutty, these are tomatoes. And one thing we could do is we could draw just the thick lines here. That's the sort of consensus phylogeny between different algorithms. Or we could say, working with different data sets and different modes of inference, we get all of the things that look kind of like pencil rubbings here. Those are all different trees overlapping each other. And probably that's true because it turns out, tomatoes like to hybridize a lot. And the real evolutionary history is the kind of cloudy, messy, overlapping phylogenies here, and not the nice, clean, draw thin line sort of phylogeny, right? And it took until the 21st century for biologists to start to recognize that they're getting information from discordance rather than trying to pick one true tree. And that brings me to the last chapter. Yeah.
Or that these are trees anymore, right? So what with the kinds of analyses that what do they decide? Do they decide, okay, we'll just have multiple trees with different evidence, or our theory on top of all this is just not tree-like?
That's not a settled question. There's not a settled answer to that question. And so, here's what I would say, and I point you, if you want some of this, to the, let's see if I can get to the right citation. Oh, back. No. Okay, so this Haber citation here, he goes over some of the recent history in biology of trying to handle this. And, there's a minute where people thought the options were either there's one true tree and we can identify it, or the tree thinking is just a mistake, right? And now we still have both those options, and there are prominent people who think that those are both right options. But now there's this sort of third camp that says we can have a particular aspect of a complex evolutionary history that is accurately represented by a tree. And that's not going to be the full evolutionary history of a complex lineage. But even though there are going to be some kinds of evolutionary change for which aren't tree-like, it is possible to represent much of evolutionary history by thinking of overlapping trees or nested trees or things like that, right? And that's the option I'm sort of embracing to make my point today. But certainly those other options are still available to you, right? All right, so thanks, John. Good question. So what would happen if we take that middle option, the taking discordance as potentially informative, seriously in linguistic phylogenetics? That's where I want to end up today. So I'm going to put together some of the ingredients that I put on the table today. The first ingredient is one where we don't take trees to be direct 100% true representations of reality. And pretty much everyone who's using these methods in linguistics admits this. So here's some computational phylogeneticists saying, look, everyone understands that language family trees are idealizations, right? Similarly, pretty much everyone admits that there's no one best algorithm for producing phylogeny, so they each have their strengths and weaknesses, right? So if we understand that, you know, our models are models and there's no one best one and some of them serve certain purposes better than others, that's one piece of the puzzle here. Second is not to say that we should always try and reconcile discordance, but just to recognize reconciliation about discordance as an option. That it's possible that when we get competing trees from different sets of data or different methods, that we're learning partial complex evolutionary histories. And finally, the point I made about 10 minutes ago, that different features of language are going to evolve according to different kinds of evolutionary processes, which is going to suggest that language is going to be the kind of thing like those tomatoes that involves a very complex set of different kinds of evolutionary histories. So when we put that together, I think we can draw a few lessons from this. Lesson one is that contrary both to people who would think that computational phylogenetics is just an improvement on traditional methods, and therefore when we get a computational phylogenetics result, it should replace the comparative method results, and also contrary to the people who think that there just should be no place for computational phylogenetics and linguistics, the introduction of computational phylogenetics is great because, first of all, we don't think there's one best model. Second, we think that when we get two trees that disagree with each other, that can be informative about evolution in ways that we wouldn't otherwise know. And finally, that we might be representing different parts of the complex different sets of ways that language evolves. So it's great that we now have multiple methods for drawing trees in linguistics. I think this is probably what most people think, but there are definitely those loud, angry people who make black and yellow slides who don't think this. So it's a point worth making. Second, while there are definitely going to be cases in historical linguistics where trees are just wrong, and there are probably going to be lots of those cases because it's hard to do inference about the past. The first question we should ask, I think, when we get discordance in linguistics is there a way in which we can reconcile this? Right? That before we say we're going to throw two trees into the ring and only one gets to exit, which might then make it so that we never ask the question, is there some way to reconcile this? The first question we should ask is, can we reconcile this before we ask the question, should we just eliminate one of these trees? And finally, the point I promised I was going to get to at the beginning of the talk, once we're pluralists about language trees and think that different methods might be representing different features of complex evolutionary histories, then the methodological choices we're making up here in the top part of this figure are going to matter to the types of inference we make here. And what I don't see in the contemporary literature is a whole lot of thinking through that. What I see is I ran my algorithm, here's the best tree. And then given that this is the best tree, here's what it says about the geographical origin of these people, or here's what it says about whether or not these two peoples have some shared cultural ancestry, or here's what it says about the ancestral cultural practices of these peoples, right? And no explicit justification in terms of whether or not the aspects of complex evolutionary history being represented by that tree are the right ones to map on to those other cultural properties. And that's what I'd like to see. So if you give me 5 more minutes, I'll end with a warning. So this is not something that I think has happened in computational phylogenetics and linguistics yet, but here's a bad thing that happened in sort of a related field studying human history. And here I'm drawing on work by Joyce Hafstad. I know this looks really small on these slides. The paper's called Sensational Science and Archaic Hominin Genetics. And what I'm going to, the example that I'm about to run through is not one of bad science. It's a good, sophisticated scientific inference, nor does it an example of scientists holding unethical positions, but it's going to be an instance of scientists using weak evidence to support a sort of claim about human history in a way that ends up doing bad things in the world. So this is a table of all of the data that's going to be used for certain kinds of genetic inference about Denisovans. Denisovans are an early hominin, roughly contemporaneous with both some of our human ancestors and Neanderthals. The Denisovans lived in Asia. And this is our complete evidence set. It's a finger bone, some partial teeth. And on the basis of analysis of individual specimens of these, scientists in high-profile venues like Science and Nature make claims like this. 4.6% of the genome of present-day Melanesians might come from the Denisova. Or a study of Denisova 8, meaning this one particular partial molar, indicates increased gene flow from Denisova to Papuans and Australians relative to other populations. And this is interesting, and these are good scientific research questions to be asking. And then what happens is the scientists sensationalize them and publish. This comes from the journal Science. They publish things like this, where they put up sort of a stereotypical image of a group of people, and then say, you know, our research says that Melanesians like these Macao tribesmen in Papua New Guinea show genetic evidence of ancient Denisovan ancestry. And as should have been predictable, this is the sort of thing that, say, white supremacists online picked up on and started saying, look, scientists have discovered that, you know, these peoples who we racialize as primitive are, you know, partially non-human, or things like that, right? And this is what, you know, these scientists have been taken to task for by people like Havstad. And what most of their more sophisticated critics have said is not like you shouldn't be doing this research or you shouldn't be publishing this research. The claim has been, you want to make sure that your standards of evidence that you're using are high enough to reflect the potentially socially risky claims you're supporting here. And their standards of evidence are not very high. Again, they're working from some really fragmentary fossils that have some really fragmentary DNA, and then making big claims about big groups of people, right? They're probably not meeting any sort of even modest standard of evidence here. And that doesn't seem like too much to ask. And my worry is that we might run into similar problems in historical linguistics and using computational phylogenetics when we make big sweeping claims about the histories of large groups of people. And we could run into similar issues because the use cases for linguistic phylogenetics, and I've given you examples of all of these in the slides today, even if I brush by them quickly, are often about, you know, places where we might run into sensitive cultural issues or where the research could impact vulnerable populations. So just to give you one example, this recent paper, I'm not saying anyone is objecting to this paper, but it's the sort of thing where you might predict that that could be a possibility. So again, this paper about Uto-Aztecans is generating a phylogenetic tree, and then on the basis of that one tree saying, here's the right account of the history of these peoples, and making some pretty substantive claims about not just geographic origins, but dates of divergence and migration and ancestral cultural practices. And this could at least be potentially objectionable, because these peoples often have their own accounts of their geographic origins and their migration patterns and their cultural practices, and these peoples also often disagree with each other. Different tribes will disagree with each other about these issues, right? Which is not to say that we shouldn't do scientific research to try and provide evidence for these claims. It's to say that if you're going to do this research, you want to be very careful that you're meeting the kinds of standards of evidence you would want when you're dealing with a socially sensitive issue like this. And if I'm right about the sort of sensitivity of inferring historical claims from phylogenetic trees, then we're not meeting those standards of evidence here, right? Because there's no explicit justification of why this particular set of data and this particular method is relevant to these types of historical claims. And there's probably also a mistake in thinking that there's going to be one true tree here that's going to answer these questions. And hopefully there is no controversy surrounding this sort of things, but I want to sort of raise the warning that, like, this is the sort of thing that you might step into some scientific controversy without intending to. Okay, so here's the main lessons I had. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.